With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Shaneequa.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So, do introduce me. In my culture, I'm what's called a winktè, which is a third gender. And in most indigenous cultures, there is a role. And for a lot of sort of across Indian country, they sort of call it two spirits, but most tribes have their own word for that thing. And in mine just happens to be winktè. And those folks had important spiritual and social roles in the community. And so sometimes that meant that we were called to be reconcilers, because we walked between the masculine world and the feminine world, and we walked between the natural world and the supernatural world. And so we're often called to be reconcilers and healers and spiritual leaders in our community. My Indian name, which was given to me by my grandfather, was his Indian name also, is Tokala Ehake, and it sort of loosely translates to last warrior. It really means the last member of the Kit Fox Warrior Society. It's a very specific type of warrior, but it's the person who stays behind in the battle so that other people can get away safely. And so I think of that when I do the work that I do, and how am I and how are we ensuring that other folks can get to safety or be safe. And sometimes in the Christian context, I think about safety as salvation. In any case, it's great to be here. I'm very excited that I could be with you here today. And I will try and keep the chat open. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in there. I did do some slides to help the conversation, and hopefully that will help move things along. I did want to say I used to work in northern Wisconsin as an epidemiologist, and we served the tribes in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So I have been all over the great state of Michigan, including the UP and the Mitten. So so you'll see. Let's see here. Let me just share my screen. Okay, perfect. And how to make that. There we go. Okay. So just some things that I think are kind of important places to start are that, American Indians are not all the same. Every group has different and unique relationships with the government. Some tribes are federally recognized tribes, some are state recognized. Each of us have different languages. Different people spell things differently. Various different origin stories, even like the Dakota origin story from the Lakota origin story, those are different. We have different gender roles. Some tribes have clans, some don't. So just, yeah. And let me talk a little bit, I'm going to go back to talk about names. Often your Indian name is given, you as a child don't have a name. You're just the child of so-and-so and so-and-so. And then when you reach a certain age, when they kind of have a sense of who you are, then they give you a name based on your behavior, who you are. And then later, sometimes that name will change. If you've done something significant or changed your life in some way, you might get a new name. And in some tribes, like the Oneida, they will change their name based on your age. So they'll give you a child name versus an adolescent name versus an adult name versus an elder name. And usually those names will reflect, it'll be clear whether you're a child, an adolescent, an adult, or an elder in the name. Blossoming Flower would be an example of maybe a name you would get as a child or an adolescent, where you wouldn't give that to an elder. So I always have to kind of talk about this a little bit, just because sometimes people don't know the history, and this helps people understand. So if we were to put all the different sort of interactions that Native folks had with the colonizing forces, they kind of fall into these broad categories. At the beginning, that colonial to 1820, those sort of treaties and interactions were very much like, I love you and you love me, and we're going to mutually support each other, and daisies and unicorns and all of that. And then the second sort of stage was, now we don't care where you go, you just cannot be in this area, so you need to go somewhere else, and we don't want you here. And that's kind of like 13 colonies time. And then it went from that to being like this movement to reservation. So now it's no longer you can go anywhere but here. Now it's you will go only within this space and only within this place, and we don't want you to come out of that space. In this 1887 to 1934, that was where they really wanted Native folks to be more like white people and assimilate. And so they also wanted the land. So they took the land and divided up and gave it to the male head of household in the hope that then we would become like farmers, because they didn't like that we shared the land communally. And so that was like the next sort of phase. That was also a way that they took a lot of land. So if you look at reservation areas, who owns what land, it will often look like a checkerboard. It's because a lot of the land got taken in various different ways. Sometimes outright stolen. Okay. Then reorganization was when they sort of took Indians off the reservations and put them in big cities. And that is, and the goal was like to have us, become cosmopolitan. So you have some major cities where natives were relocated to. And so like Minneapolis, Denver, LA, Oakland, Detroit. There's a lot more that I'm forgetting, but just know that there's a lot of those places. And so you'll often find urban Indian groupings of people there in that space. And it was during that time that this sort of pan-Indian sense of identity came about, and which didn't exist before. And then came termination, which was this idea that we don't want to have to deal with quote unquote the Indian problem anymore. So we're just going to terminate y'all and you don't exist. And we're going to pretend there's no such thing as an Indian. And that started to happen. And then now we're sort of in this messy time of sort of self-determination, which is this novel idea that maybe Indians know what's best for themselves. So that's that. And I use the word Indian because that's a legal word. It means a member of a federally recognized tribe. I'll sometimes use the word indigenous, which is like a broader grouping that includes a lot more people, or Native American. What some people don't know is about what's called Grant's peace policy. So after the Dakota conflict of 1862, which happened in Minnesota over some eggs, they put all the Dakota people in Fort Snelling, which is kind of by the Twin Cities, and they sentenced 300 some of them to die, to be killed. And Bishop Whipple, who was an Episcopal bishop, rode down to talk to Abraham Lincoln along with another priest, Episcopal priest, and sort of said, hey, this isn't fair. This is what really happened. You need to fix this. And so they retried people, and then instead they hung 38 people at a town called Mankato. It's the largest mass hanging in the history of our nation. They had to build special gallows and everything. And I guess it's not really that happy of a fact, but the song that the people were singing as they were going to their death and just before they're being hung is in our hymnal. It's the Many and Great that you'll find in the hymnal in 1982. And so when you sing that, keep in mind that that's not really a happy hymn for us. And so I know people sometimes like to play that and think that, oh, it's this beautiful Indian song. It actually has that memory with it. And it's appropriate for that purpose because traditionally that was a song you'd sing as somebody was entering the next life. You're asking, I know you know the words, well, hopefully you know the words, maybe you haven't heard the song, but the second verse is talking about that, you know, you want to have eternal life with the Creator, and that's why that song would be sung at that time. Anyway, after all that, the government, in its infinite wisdom, decided that the corrupt Indian agents, the people who were responsible for caretaking the Indians on the reservation, that they could solve this corruption by making churches the Indian agents of these different reservations. And so they doled out Christian denominations to the various reservations throughout the area. And so you can see on this map the various reservations, the various denominations that were assigned to the reservations. And so in your area down by Michigan, you have Methodist. There's all sorts of Methodist, Lutheran, Congregational, Presbyterian, Quaker, of course, Episcopalian, Catholic. There's some Dutch Reformed. What often happened was they were responsible then for caretaking the folks on the reservation. They were supposed to indoctrinate them into the Christian faith and all of those kind of things. A lot of the denominations pulled out later because they felt like they were in over their head. And then the Quakers, the Catholics, and the Episcopalians were the major three that sort of came in and continued that work. And if you wonder where I'm from down here where it says Whetstone and Upper Missouri. That's where the area where I'm from, and it was assigned to the Episcopalians. So you wonder how I'm an Episcopalian. That's how. Anyway, that created a lot of bad things that happened too. So that came with it boarding schools, and my grandpa was and my grandma were boarding school. I don't know what you want to call people who were in boarding school. The picture on the left are Chiricahua Apache children entering boarding school. They've just gotten off of a 3-day train ride in that picture at Carlisle. And then you can see those same children on the right 4 months later. And what I always tell people, and these pictures, they did this with a lot of children. They took pictures like this to show that they were being civilized. What I tell people is if you look at the picture on the left, everything that those children have on means something. The fact that that one kid has a bandana on his head, that means something. Just like if you were to look at each other, if you have a ring on this finger, in our culture, that means something. Or if you see somebody and they have an orange jumpsuit on, that means something in our culture. And so by taking all of those things away, they've taken away that person's personhood. In my culture, if someone, has their hair in braids versus short hair, that means something. Or if they have one braid in and one braid out, that means something too. And when we take away those things, we're taking away that person's personhood. Sometimes I think the theological question originally at the early church was, must one become a Jew before one becomes a Christian? And of course, Paul answered that for us and said, no, you don't have to become a Jew to become a Christian. But I think somehow our church forgot that and somehow thought that we must become white before we became a Christian. And we might think about that today too. Must one become straight before you can become a Christian, or cisgendered before you become a Christian? Something to think about. And I think what we need to consider as we're thinking about that is like, when Christianity comes to a group of people, it's going to look different when they put it on. It will look different for an indigenous person than it will for a white person, or it will look different for an LGBT person than it will for a straight person. And how, because you're talking about different cultures, and how they adapt it, how it might look, doesn't make it right or wrong. But I think sometimes we as, in our ethnocentrism, we think that there's one right way to do something. When the Episcopal Church came to Indian country, we had some things that we tried to work with. So we often have naming ceremonies. That is very similar to the rite of baptism and what that might look like. As Lakota people, we definitely care and look at those different rites of passage. And confirmation sort of served as a kind of puberty rite. Some people still do puberty rites. I know my cousin, she got her girl becoming a woman ceremony puberty rite. And our various warrior societies, they did the planting society. And then, of course, in our area, we do Sundance. And we now do Niobrara Convocation, but Sundance still happens. this I just wanted to share because I think it's kind of a cool piece of our history. So I have this little cross that I wear. It's called a Niobrara cross. And it was created by Bishop Hare, who was the first bishop of the Diocese of the Niobrara, which was basically all the Indians. And he knew that we couldn't read. And so when we would get a baptismal certificate, it wouldn't make any sense to us. And so instead, he created this sign, or the symbol, outward and visible sign of inward and spiritual grace, this cross that says that we've been baptized or confirmed. And now everybody in our diocese, when you get baptized or you get confirmed, you get a cross like this. And if you look at the cross, in the corners here, it kind of looks like a medicine wheel, and these are 4 teepees with little crosses on them, and it represents Christ coming to the native people, and that then we are there to carry out the gospel in all the directions. And around the outside here, it says something like, by the grace of God, Bishop Hobart Hare, the blah, 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 Bishop of the Diocese of Niobrara. This says that they may have life. And that is a thing that we use when we do Sundance. Because when we Sundance so that the people may live. And Jesus died so that the people may live also. Okay. Andrew, I'm going to ask you to let me know when I have like 5 or 10 minutes left. Just put it in the chat. Okay. So in a healthy society, you have like one generation who carries out and passes on what I like to call their cultural DNA, your culture, your parenting, your customs, your language, your love, your heritage, all of that to the next generation, who then passes on to the next generation. So that even though that first generation or previous generations are gone, you have that same cultural DNA getting passed on. That's how it's supposed to work. And as you're thinking about it yourself, think about, are you Packer fans? Are you Bears fans? Are you Lions fans? Or another thing that sometimes I ask people are, what constitutes Thanksgiving dinner? What's the thing that has to be on the plate? Like for me, there has to be cranberries and turkey. Everything else is kind of negotiable, but those 2 things must be there. Where did you learn that? How do you resolve conflict? Are you a shouter and a yeller, or are you quiet and passive aggressive? You know, how do you figure those things out? Where did you learn those things from? All of those things usually come from your grandmas and grandpas and aunties and uncles. With historical generational trauma, something comes and blocks that cultural DNA transmission. And so here's a picture from the reservation nearby where I used to work. This is the Lac du Flambeau Indian School. And if you look at it, I always ask people, how many children in that picture are smiling? And if you look, there's really just 2 here. And many children would run away. And if they ran away from here, they actually got sent to Mount Pleasant in Michigan if they ran away. And that's where they would go. My grandpa got sent to Carlisle, which was all the way over in Pennsylvania, and he's from South Dakota. And about 50% of the children who went to boarding school never returned because they either died or they had been adopted by white families, even though they had their own native families who still wanted them. And there's lots of like physical abuse, sexual abuse, all of that happened there. My grandpa would tell stories every once in a while, but not very often because I think it was just really traumatic for him. One story that he would tell was that when he got there, they wouldn't allow him to eat anything except what he could say in English. And so he had to eat cornflakes because that's the only thing he knew for like the first 6 months that he was there. And ever since then, he hated cornflakes. He would never eat cornflakes. And there were other things that happened. I'm sure there was a lot of sexual abuse. So with generational and historical trauma, that DNA doesn't get passed. And in our case, it was, boarding schools and government policies. And so instead, you have this generation that's missing that cultural DNA. And so they're passing on all of that loss of language, land, loss of culture, the abuse, adoption, genocide, all that stuff. And so even though the boarding schools aren't there anymore and the government policies have gotten better, what's getting passed on is that negative stuff, the suicide, the violence, the abuse, the addiction, hopelessness, fear, all of that stuff. And so sometimes people will say something like, wow, that happened so long ago. Why don't you just get over it? This is why we cannot get over it. It's like a cancer. Until, cancer is like when the cells just keep replicating and they're replicating cells with bad DNA, same thing. Until you heal that cultural DNA, until we put some energy into fixing that, that won't get fixed. It will continue to be that way. And this is not just that, what do I want to say? That happens in a lot of other examples. Like you could think about things like the Holocaust or slavery, Japanese internment, even HIV/AIDS and the LGBTQ community. All of that kind of are examples of this historical trauma causing events. I always tell people there's some symptoms of historical generational trauma. These are common ones. I'll just read a few because the writing kind of small: depression, anxiety, isolation, shame, addiction, loss of concentration, violence, and suicide, etc. The one I point out is this one here that says discomfort around certain people. As Indian people, there are some groups that we don't generally trust and we are not very keen on. And one of them is clergy and church folks and researchers or scientists or the medical industry and the government. Those are some of the big ones. And so if you are a part of any one of those groups and you want to work with American Indians, you need to take a lot of time to build trust and relationship before you just come in there, or you can have some really negative consequences. I think if you look at like Black folks and trusting medical institution is very similar. I know they're talking a lot about that with the vaccinations right now. Because of that history, you got like the Tuskegee experiment and a host of other issues. The same thing happened to us too. We often were the guinea pigs for other things. So some of the issues that are in your area, well, these aren't just in your area, but I think that came up that I just want to mention. The tribes in the Great Lakes area, there was this huge land thing that the ceded territory, they ceded the land in this area. It's basically the northern part of Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. When they ceded that land, they retained the right to hunt and fish on it. That was part of the treaty that they signed. So in that way, I don't know if any of you have bought a home, but it's kind of like an easement where like they have the right to go through your property. It is still your property, but they have the right to go through it and do certain things there. That's kind of how that works too. So the tribes in the northern area of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota have the right to hunt and fish on that land. But that's a big conflict because people don't like that. And there's usually huge fights about it. I know in Wisconsin, they had to call in the National Guard. That was more in the 90s. But there's still issues now. Just this last year, somebody got shot doing spearing out on the lake. And that continues to happen. Resource extraction is another common thing that you'll see with folks. You saw probably the biggest example would be like at Standing Rock with them trying to put in the pipeline. And one of my biggest frustrations was the pipeline was going to be not touch the reservation and kind of go close to Bismarck, but that's where all the white people live and they didn't want it there. So then they're like, okay, it's okay. We can put it over on the Indian area. We just, as long as it's not in our area. And that sort of sparked a whole host of things. And there's lots of issues with that across the country, not just pipelines like in Alaska. The way they do the gas lines and things actually change the migratory patterns of the caribou. And so you have some of these caribou where they're not able to intermingle. Usually twice a year, they'll come together and be able to breed. And that intermingling is what helps keep the caribou herd strong, because then they're not reproducing with their own sort of DNA group. I don't know how to make that sound kind of complicated. But anyway, just know that as a result of some of those pipelines, bad things have happened to the animals. And of course, missing and murdered Indigenous women. That's a new one that a lot of people aren't aware of. We've known about it for a long time. There's a lot of women who disappear, and I know Reverend Leon Sampson, who is in Navajo land, he's a priest there, talked about that there was this van that came by his reservation. I think he was talking about a couple of weeks ago, and they look for young girls and women to just take in the van, and they'll just drive off with them. They usually get killed and never are found again. Also, American Indian women are raped at the highest rate of any other group, because what happens is on the reservation, someone who's not Indian can come on the reservation, rape someone, and they cannot be held accountable for it unless the federal government, the FBI, were to come in and prosecute that. And they don't do that because for them, that's not important enough. They only do it if somebody's killed or murdered. And it's because the federal government doesn't give tribes the ability to prosecute crimes unless it's their own people on the reservation. And so that's why you'll see something called VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. They're trying to make it possible for that to happen. It would be kind of like if you in Michigan came to Minnesota and committed a crime, and then you couldn't be held accountable in Minnesota because you committed that crime and you're from Michigan. And of course, our suicide rates are really high. That's the leading cause of death for young adults, like for children and young adults aged 14 to 25. Suicide is the leading cause of death in that age group for our people. This is an example of the federal spending. It's kind of old, but it's an example of the federal spending per person on healthcare. And what I'd like to point out here is this is like the standard is about $5,000 a year for a person. Here's what we spend on federal prisoners' healthcare. And down here is what we spend on Indian healthcare per person. So I'm not advocating that federal prisoners don't deserve good healthcare. I believe we all deserve good healthcare. But we spend less on American Indian health than we do on the healthcare of federal prisoners. And this down here, sometimes people are like, what is this non-medical? That's things like having paved roads or having a sewer system in your area. It's not medical care. It's like basic public health things. And for most of the tribes that I'm aware of, in the treaty signing, the federal government has a responsibility to provide health care to the American Indian people. And they do, but at a terrible place. For every dollar that the Indian Health Service needs, it gets usually about 53 cents. Okay. A lot of people think Indians are all rich because of casinos. Many tribes have casinos. About half of them. Most of them, when they have the casinos, they use that money to reinvest into their community. Some of them use that money to supplement the money from the Indian Health Service to provide health care. And this is kind of old, but in 2006, only 73 of those distributed funds to its members. If you get money from the casino, it's called a per capita payment. Mount Pleasant would be an example of one of the wealthy ones. Potawatomi in Wisconsin would be an example of another one. Those really tribes who are really wealthy have a lot more to do with the number of people you have in your tribe and how close your casino is to a major city. Like Potawatomi has one in Milwaukee, or Mystic Lake has one in the Twin Cities. The vast majority do not make a lot of money. My tribe has a casino. We make enough money to give people jobs, and that's basically it. I've never gotten a per capita payment, by the way, from my community. Okay. American Indian folks with gender and sexuality, we have a different relationship. I talked a little bit about that already, walking in between way. With colonization also came patriarchy, and then really trying to quash this idea. They thought it was sinful. And in our culture, folks like this were considered sacred. This person here on the left is Biwa. She's Zuni, and she's a male-bodied two-spirit. Her community loved her, and everybody saw that she was like elevated in the community, so they wanted to take her to DC. And the thought was that if they wined and dined her in DC, she would sign whatever treaties they wanted. And they didn't know that she was like biologically a man. Anyway, there's a whole story about it. It's a very interesting story, but her people love her so much. And often that was the case in most of those situations. And that's been my experience when I've worked in different reservations. I've never experienced homophobia on different reservations where I've worked. Only in the border towns where the white people live has something like that happened to me. And I think in 6th grade, somebody in class like said faggot or something. And then the teacher stopped the class. She did a whole lecture on winktè and how we're supposed to treat them and how they're sacred people. Never again did that come up in my entire time of my education. This is a picture of Balboa executing two spirits. We often think it's just indigenous people, but often that by doing that, they not only killed people, but they also killed our two spirit people, but also our history keepers and are the people who had the knowledge of our sacred ceremonies. Okay, this is the last thing I'm going to share. And I always talk about this. Sometimes when I tell this story, it makes me cry, but I'm going to try not to. So this is a people's series developed by the Cultural Wellness Center out of the Twin Cities. And on the left is the downward process. And what it kind of says is, as you lose your culture, you will lose your health. So as we lose our culture and sort of this rugged individualism, we lose our sense of belonging and worth, and that makes us feel isolated from and disconnected from the community, which causes depression and lethargy, which then causes this ill health, disease, and decay of the community. Okay, and classic example, you know, take away Indians' way of life, or hunting or fishing, give us foods that are high in fat, salt, and sugar, and what do you think is going to happen? Well, we're going to get diabetes and heart disease and die, which is what happens. On the other side, they said, as you increase your culture, as you do things that empower folks and empower the culture and find ways to incorporate culture into the ministry that you do, as you do those things, you will gain your health. And so develop a philosophy of community, have strong interaction with folks in the community, which builds then a sense of self-worth. And then you have the optimism, energy, and power, and then you have healthy and safe neighborhoods. And the example I'm going to tell you, I was in Wisconsin in Lac du Flambeau where I was. So we had a man who's an artist in the community. He came and he wanted to build a canoe with the kids in the elementary school. By the way, the school is a public school. It's not a tribal school. But it's on the reservation, so that's where most of all the tribal kids go. And so the school's like, yeah, let's do it. And so he was teaching them about science and biology and math and all this stuff in the process of building this canoe. So they put the spine of the canoe down. They got the birch bark off the tree. They laid that down. They did the pitch, and I don't know how to build a canoe, but I know the different basic parts. So they're doing all that. And there's these different kids that were doing that in the school. And this is up to like 8th grade, I think. And then one day I was leaving work and I was going to go get lunch. And I saw all these people lined up on the road. And I'm like, what is going on? And usually if there's like a parade, I'll know about it because they'll announce it and stuff. And sometimes they'll release us from work to go participate. And then so I asked somebody because I'm nosy, and they're like, oh, they're putting the canoe in the water today. And everybody's like buzzing about it. Everybody's excited. And so on the day that they were putting the canoe to test it, this was such a powerful moment that this cultural, incorporating culture into the community or incorporating culture into the work of the school, or resurrecting the culture, maybe. It was such a powerful moment that people were leaving their houses, elders were lined down the streets, and then come these kids and with an artist, and the kids are carrying this canoe, and some of the kids are marching behind, and they're singing, and they're just filled with pride and filled with excitement and this sense of self-esteem and self-worth, all those things that so many of our kids miss. We have the lowest educational attainment of any ethnic group. All of that stuff was instilled in them through just something so simple as building a canoe. And they walked that canoe down to the lake, put it in, and made sure it worked. And it was just this beautiful moment, I think, of like a powerful moment of how something so simple could be so transformative. And so, okay, with that, I think I'm done. Yeah.
Shaneequa, thank you. Having listening as well as trying to respond to some of the chats in the section, so or going on behind the scenes. So thank you for your sharing. And I want to bring Father Walter into this conversation as well. You know, one of the things that jumped out at me, and you it's funny, your conclusion there stole my thunder on questions. So I'm going to pivot my question for you, because one of the realities of racism is that it has generational impacts in the same way that the white community has been able to pass on privilege through economic, education, status, translation. I think it's important for us to realize that racism has the correlating negative impact, that it passes on its trauma, despair, technical poverty, generationally. It is something that, and that downward movement that I think that you closed us with is I think a really clear reminder that what started 100, 200, 300, 400 years ago is still with us in not just in individuals, but within whole segments of society, in communities. And so I wonder if you might just unpack for us a little bit. I appreciated the upward movement side of the slide, but maybe you can explore for us a little bit more concretely what you think. What's your vision of that movement within a particular community? We'll have, it'll look different whether it's the Hawaiian community or the Black community or the Lakota community. But so just whether it's Lakota or others, what does that upward movement look like? What are the signs or some of the practices that you think are critical for that? You're muted, my friend. It's the Zoom.
That's like, I think, going to be the buzzword for 2020 and 2021. It will look different based on where you are, of course, but I'm going to tell you what the Cultural Wellness Center did. And I went to a class. That's how I learned about it. I went to a class, and the class took place there. And when you walk into their space, there's something there for everyone. And what I noticed was they had a star quilt on the wall, kind of like the one behind me. And that made me feel safe because I recognized that as an Indian thing. And I'm like, okay, this is a good place for me. But they had stuff from every culture you could think of. There was like a cuckoo clock on the wall. And that was really important for other cultures, right? And so what they've done is they have these sort of, I can't remember what they call them, but for lack of a better way, I'm just going to call them elder groups. So they have like an elder group in every culture. So they have like a Native American one, the Black one, Latino, Asian, and white one. And that group of people, and they interpret elder differently. It doesn't have to be an old person. It really means someone with a specific group of knowledge. Sometimes they're an old person. But those group of people would try and work on what are some issues that we can work on in our community that will help our community get better, that will increase our cultural knowledge in our community. And so it varied. The Black group, the biggest one that they did was like this doula program where there was like these Black women and they got trained in how to be doulas, and they would follow every woman who was having their babies. And because of that, they were able to reduce the number of cesarean sections that happened, the number of early births, which is a problem in Black communities. They have a early birth. We think it's because of the cortisol, which is a stress hormone that is released from all the stress that Black women and Black people in general have to undergo. And those women were amazing advocates for people when they were having their baby. With the Native American, they also did a doula group, but then they also did a kind of like an exercise type thing. The white group, they looked at racism, and they also looked at how are we increasing our sense of culture? Because right now we just think of this whiteness, and but we don't really look at like what is like. They looked at some Scandinavian, I don't know what's called, like mythology stuff in Scandinavia. They started teaching people stories about that, and they looked at some different things to help people not identify so much with just being white, but really identify with the culture. And that really helped improve, I think, and change how people identify and how they can then identify with folks of color differently. So I think it looks different based on where you are. But I think if you were to think about the ministry that you're doing, think about who are you serving in that ministry, and how might you incorporate aspects of their culture into that ministry, right? Like instead of just doing something to someone, how are you doing it with them, and how are you making sure that they have a part in shaping what that looks like? Like a food bank in Indian country, we would want and look at different foods that might be distributed. For like Indian people up north, fish is a huge part of their diet, and wild rice. And so those food banks in the northern Wisconsin, they tried to shift, and they contracted with some of the fishermen and fisherwomen up in the up above in the Great Lake there by the Apostle Island. And they bought fish from them to give away in the food bank so that the people coming in could have stuff that's from their culture. They also asked some of the hunters, if you're not eating your deer, give us your deer, we'll get it processed for you, and we'll make sure we can pass that out to the native folks who are coming for food in that area. So it really can be shaped based on where you are and who you're serving.
I think that personalization or localization, that's a better way to say it, of response and honoring of disparate identities, not disparate as in unrelated, but just varied, and the different identities and that we bring is a critical part of our future and our healing. One of the things that struck me as in that profound picture that you showed of side by side of students before, and I think can't remember 4 days or 4 months after arriving, and that entire loss of identity represented just in those pictures. And the honoring of one identity, the identity of white Western European clothing, attire, hair style. I mean, obviously in education and all of that. How we have diminished the identity of our non-white community and brothers and sisters and friends. So how do we actually intentionally honor our friends who are not just friends but part and parcel to our community? Walter, I know you've been patient. Thank you for that. What are some of the thoughts and questions that you bring to this conversation?
Well, so first, Shaneequa, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm actually glad this is the last one that I'm here sitting in a house on the land of the Potawatomi, and next week at this time I will be relocated to the land of the Benaki. But we had earlier. What I wanted to first say, my first reaction, Shaneequa, is that if I don't want to project if I'm incorrect in this, but in some ways that term that we use a lot now, intersectionality, that Indians, Native communities, Indigenous, they invented it centuries ago in a way of this understanding of you as winktè, in that gender, sexuality, and race, they are all dynamically interrelated, and that, if you will, sort of binary, and some of my research before you're joining us today seemed to be about that when North America, and I think probably other parts of the world, certainly as Father Drew talked about Hawaii, were colonized, that these kinds of things were problematic. Problematic for the Westerners. One of the things I read is that they really had a hard time with this understanding of multiplicity of genders, more than two, and of the two-spirit idea. If what I read online is correct, and you please correct me if I'm wrong. And here's the point for us as a church, and this is what Caitlin Curtis talked about as a woman. I'm actually forgetting now. It's from Oklahoma, Cherokee woman on her father's side, but then having to her mother, who was a white European, and after her parents' divorce, spending most of the school year with her mother, and then summers in Oklahoma with her father, and finding so much of her young, sort of teenage years, young adulthood in evangelical churches, that besides the patriarchal oppression and pressure that she experienced, in this idea of conforming. And so in preparation for you coming, just reading how much of, you mentioned it, and you were kind in the way you mentioned it, but really Christian churches were very much involved, obviously in the schools, but in other ways, of the trauma, the historic. I mean, this was not the Ku Klux Klan as Black people. This was the Church of Jesus Christ being the purveyors of the trauma. And so that's my reaction. And I just want to first name that, and whether that, if what I'm saying is accurate. And then I think the question is, so then what do we as the church today do? How do we as the church, I don't know what the right word would be. Reconciliation is it's almost a weak word, because to be reconciled, you have to have been conciled before. We've always been divided on race, and I'm not simply talking binary black, white, but, all over. So, but how do, what does the church do? What do Christians do? That's sort of my, question after my reaction.
I'm putting a little thing in the chat, which I'll talk about in a minute, but I usually talk about it in terms of wo lakota. So in our language, wo lakota means the state when all things are in right relationship. And so, when we are in right relationship with ourselves, when we're in right relationship with each other, when we're in right relationship with creation, and when we're in right relationship with the Creator, right? And so reconciliation is trying to get to that state of wo lakota. And I think that's what the gospel is calling us to do, right? Or when we talk about the kingdom, that's the place that it's calling us to be, that place of right relationship. And I think we might always not know how to get there, but we can tell when we're not in right relationship. And if we were to look at the events of maybe the last 2 weeks with the Washington National Cathedral and its relationship with the LGBT community, that would be an example of what isn't right relationship, right? But I think those apologies are there to help try and build that space. What I usually tell people in terms of like the intersectionality piece is, imagine that we are each beautiful flowers, and each petal of our flower is a different identity. So on one petal might be like my gender, one might be my sex, one might be sexual orientation, one might be income, one might be the languages that I speak, one might be where I grew up, one might be my socioeconomic status, etc. And all of those little things make up the beautiful flower that I am, just like they make up the beautiful flowers that all of you are. We cannot talk about the flower by looking at just one petal. That would be unfair. And how many times have we been judged by just one of our petals when that doesn't make up the whole of who we are, right? We also get different amounts of power based on those petals. And that's what what I put in the chat is this little worksheet called a power flower. And you can look at those different identities that are each a petal. And usually what you do is you color in, and the more you color in is the more power you think you have based on that identity, whatever it might be. And so on there, one example would be lay and ordained. So as a ordained person in the Episcopal Church anyway, we're fairly clerical, we went coloring a lot of power on that one. And probably a bishop would have the most maybe, and then a priest might have a little bit less or whatever, but still it's a lot. And then you might look at gender, and if you identify as a man, you might color in more because men have more power than women in our society. Anyway, but the idea is when you're done, you can look at it and see how that power might all play out for you as an individual. It's a fun activity, I shouldn't say fun, but it's a learning activity that we can do. I think it's a fun activity. And it can help you think about the different ways, like you might not have a lot of power as a person of color, but you might have a lot of power based on maybe you're a doctor or something. Anyway, something to think about.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I was just looking at that and thinking about that provocatively. So thank you for sharing that as something that we can incorporate personally, or perhaps in some kind of broader context, communally as well. Something that struck me in that is the complexity of power as something that is both internalized and externalized. What power others give versus what power one claims or believes that they possess, and I think that's I think another part of this conversation that and I think this comes into this 21st century idea around race and racism, that there are some that say, well, we dealt with racism, and blacks are equal to white, so going all the way into that race piece, and say, well, I give to a black priest or a black lay person or the same power as I give to a white priest, but it's more than just that kind of stated reality, because for generations we've been saying that to the black priest or the black lay person, you do not have as much power as the white priest or the white lay person in this conversation, and so it's not just redefining power, it's building up both the external as well as the internal claim and identity of power with as well. I'm not saying that, but it just as clearly as I want, but it struck me is that there are both sides to this. What does one internalize, as well as what does one externalize or receive from others?